Welcome everyone to a chat between the three of us. First of all, I'm Sam. I'm a Craftsperson at Codurance, with about sort of 8 years experience across retail, healthcare, etc. Enjoying it. Mac, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my experience is 12 years in the industry across healthcare and banking, mostly software engineering, but lately quite a bit of platform engineering, and for over 10 years also leading teams here and there as well. And in Codurance for over 2 years right now, and same as you, Sam, enjoying every bit of it.
Excellent. Last but not least, Abdul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, so I'm Abdul. I've got about 8 years experience now across travel, retail, and healthcare. Mostly in agile transformation, digital transformation space with kind of software delivery. And a lot of kind of cloud sprinkled in there usually, which is always a lot of fun. Currently been at Codurance for just over a year now, and similar to everyone else, really enjoying it.
Excellent. Well, you'll be glad to know I'm going to try be on my best behavior today, not make too many jokes, which you'll all be like, whoa, what a sigh of relief. So first of all, I wanted to sort of start off with what we're going to talk about, which is software modernization, particularly around the teams working on software modernization projects. But maybe we could just go around and just sort of talk about what you define as software modernization, because we're all going to have slightly different definitions, I suppose, and how you feel it's an important thing for the industry. And the random, I want to go with you, Abdul, first. You go first.
Well, so I guess it's the heavy stuff to start with. I think so. What is software modernization? I think a lot of it depends on how you define legacy software. The way I look at legacy software is essentially software that's either accrued enough debt or natural entropy that it's no longer able to sustain the pace of innovation that's required of it from a kind of business perspective. So if we look at some systems, they naturally evolve very slowly. Perhaps they're not particularly key to the business. So we might think within most companies' perspectives, maybe a HR system might be a good example of this. There's not much need for change. So you could have a lot of entropy, a lot of debt. It doesn't matter. But you could have other systems that are quite critical. Maybe something like a pricing system might be a good example, where again, there's quite a lot of debt, but in this case, it doesn't allow the company to be competitive as a consequence. Releases are slow, and there is a higher demand for features than can be added potentially, and a lot of potential outages and problems that affect the business. So I think in those contexts, that's my context for kind of what is legacy software. It's suffered entropy and debt to the extent to which it can no longer serve its business purpose. That's my stab at it.
I mean, that's a lot nicer than you're going to hear my definition. That was pretty nice. Mac, how about yourself?
Yeah, so Abdul pretty much nailed it, but from my perspective, I would say in different words that it's something that each development team should be doing constantly, every day, because otherwise, if you're not modernizing, as you're delivering new features, as Abdul mentioned, there's this entropy and there's technical debt naturally been introduced. And additionally, once a lot of the teams that do not do that, and they end up in a place where they cannot release fast enough, or when they release, like everything breaks and they don't know why. So when they arrive at this point, when I see and they need to modernize, they don't know what that means exactly, actually. And it's not a simple thing that you can come in as a consultant and say, you need to do this, this, and this. And it's a longer process of discovery and learning about the details of the processes, and like the very much nature of modernization. If the technical debt is quite high, it requires a lot of analysis and discovery, and this consulting aspects takes quite a bit of time before we can define what modernization for this team, for this application that has this amount of technical debt would possibly be.
Nice. You both sort of somewhat annoyingly already covered what I had in my head. One thing I wanted to add was that legacy code that often we associate with software modernization. I mean, code, platform, there's different forms of legacy. But for me, it's also about the element of fear as well, in terms of there's like a fear to change something, or if I change this, I don't know what's going to happen. And as you said, Mac, like when you have that constant attention to modernizing, you're constantly trying to move forward. Because if you're trying to like adopt like a maintenance mindset, I think at some point you're going to get left behind because you're not constantly trying to move forward, and that can be from like small things, like making sure you're patching security vulnerabilities in the different bits of code that you're using, etc., to a bit larger things. But it's that constant thing within a team. So that's why I think software modernization is important, because if you don't do it, then you're going to have many issues, and this is where a lot of companies find themselves in. As we know, Abdul has a stat, but I think it's like, is it like 70% of software modernization efforts fail?
Yeah.
So it's not a small number, at least where that data came from. It's not a small number of projects. So one thing I wanted to dig into, as we said, was the team. You have this software modernization effort. So a company is identified either with like external help or themselves that they need to modernize. They can't keep doing what they're doing. It's just not sustainable. And I wanted to start, I guess, with maybe we can draw a bit of a comparison in terms of what's different between, say, a software modernization project and more sort of a greenfield, new territory sort of thing. And this could be a big topic to get into, but I don't know who wants to start with some of the differences between the two.
I guess I can rattle off a few. I think what some of the primary differences is context. So when you think about greenfield project, you're very much focused on the problem, the customer problem or the business problem that you're trying to solve, right? And in many ways, that results in a lot less restrictions, obviously, and a lower cognitive load. That's not to say that you'll necessarily write the software that solves the problem, but I think that's a different discussion. In one of the biggest differences in the legacy context is that obviously you have existing software that doesn't just have behavior embedded in it, but a lot of business assumptions. Whether they tally with how your organization expects the system to behave or not is another question again. So that context means that there's, in my mind, a lot more analysis that needs to happen, not just to understand, again, the same problem with Greenfield project. What's the problem we're trying to solve for the customer, potentially? But another set of analysis to understand the existing software, how it behaves, where it's integrated into, what other systems may be dependent on it, and how to leverage a lot of the existing capability. Because obviously with legacy, again, you start greenfield, you start small, you build up over time, and there's not the sunken cost essentially associated to it. With a legacy system, there could be 10, 20, 30 years worth of critical business capability embedded in that software that you can't just ignore. So then there's that aspect of understanding the existing software and how you can kind of leverage it to achieve a slower transformation. All of this basically, in my mind, to summarize, one of the key differences in my mind is the approach. One is for greenfields, very experimental. Let's go out there, let's see what the customer needs. The legacy projects, I feel, are much more considered to try and understand the existing business context, understand the context that the system exists in, and a meaningful way to slowly migrate that to a more modernized platform without losing the existing value.
I got a question. Do you think it's useful that maybe both ways, that people working on a software modernization project would have some experience of a greenfield project and vice versa? Because I mean, ultimately, when you're working on a greenfield project, you're potentially creating a candidate at some point for modernization somewhere down the road, if if you don't do as Max said?
I would qualify that by saying I think what you need is not necessarily someone with greenfield experience, but someone with experience building platforms that are customer focused, right? So I think you can have good greenfield projects, right, and bad ones. And for me, one of the biggest indicators of a successful project is whether it solved a customer's problem. It's allowed for business growth in a sustainable way. And I think that having that experience in a team allows us to orientate the context of the modernization to what adds value to the customer, rather than what, empirically might seem like the best thing to do because, we put it on a spreadsheet. So I think that customer focus can add a lot of value alongside with maybe a bit more innovative thinking. But I would qualify that. I don't think it's anyone from a greenfield project. I think it has to be someone with experience of delivering valuable and sustainable greenfield projects.
Mm. We'll get into a little bit more into that in terms of, I think, the different makeups and stuff. But before we get into that, maybe Mac, maybe you want to talk about some of the differences you see between the two.
So maybe let's try to give a more technical spin on this question. So if you really think about it, so the Greenfield project is people are excited about it. They're going to try out state-of-the-art technologies. I don't know, also maybe some platform engineering, new things, and go into the cloud. And that's what you think when you think about Greenfield project from a developer's perspective. And sometimes I guess when developers think about software modernization, so on an existing project, they think this huge monolith, and there's really nothing state of the art that will be revolving around that. There's nothing new that I will learn. But actually, it's to be honest, the contrary, and it's quite similar. If you really look at it in terms of a greenfield project, because there's a difference between software modernization and maintenance of existing legacy system, right? Well, modernization is this this is an educated choice. We're going to go in and we're going to bring this legacy piece of software to the state of the art form, actually. And actually, you actually learn sometimes maybe even more than in a greenfield project, because you need to be a lot more creative in terms of figuring out which state-of-the-art technologies, libraries, or some services in the cloud could potentially you be replacing in this the legacy system. So actually, there is for a developer, it's pretty much similar as a greenfield project, but I would say it's even better because they learn a lot more, because they face a lot more challenges. So that's what I think they can learn a lot more, right? And also they once they go to the greenfield project, as you started this conversation, they will already have this context that it's not easy once things the technical depth rises, need to modernize. It's not an easy thing. So once you go to the greenfield project, you have this in mind, just to make sure this doesn't turn into this monolithic problem. So that's my technical spin on it, I would say. So it's actually, from my point of view, it's quite similar to the greenfield effort and possibilities of the developers learning new things and actually using the state-of-the-art technology.
It's interesting what you said around the education piece, that it can be quite educational and you learn, and that, as you said, maybe it is good that people newer to this industry can get exposed to that earlier in their career, because then, as you said, they then go to a greener project, or move on to do more sort of software modernization work, that they have that experience, that understanding, of the things they're building, because you sort of, and to some degree, you're looking at different ends of the spectrum. With certain systems, you're looking at them sort of, they could be 15 years old, and they're looking to be modernized. There could be, then you look at a system that you're building today, and it's important, I think, to have the different perspectives. And I think that's sort of one of the things that I personally find you get from a modernization project, is you get a different perspective, and I think that's important.
And also, there's one more thing to add. It's like in between the greenfield project and this the maintenance of the legacy software, which most of the junior devs are thrown into initially. This is at least try to maintain this legacy piece of software. Is like once you are in this software modernization project bubble, actually have a license for a lot of innovations and ingenuity that you didn't have when you are only like given the task of maintaining existing software. And this is where you develop most as a developer. That's what I think.
That's really interesting. I think as well, like it's just I think it's a good experience because you also gain an appreciation for constraints. They're inevitable in anything you work on. There's going to be some constraints, but I think in software modernization, you become more aware of constraints because you can't just come in and say, oh, you're going to rip this thing out or whatever. You can't be like that blasé. You have to understand the constraints that you're working within. And I've definitely heard, things in the past where people are like, oh, why don't we just get rid of it or whatever, but you can't just, it's not just a case of getting rid of it. You need to, well, if that is genuinely what you want to do, then, how do you want to do that? And there's many different options within that we can dig into. But
yeah, and sometimes it's even, again, like this additional challenge comes in because in a greenfield project, okay, you need to set up a pipeline on a greenfield project. That's what you always do when you start. For the legacy stuff, a lot of those don't have this kind of things. But the difference is you need to set up a pipeline for, it's like a car that is parked for a greenfield project. You need to change the tire. And for software modernization, it's already running 100 miles an hour on the highway, right? And you need to change the tire while that is happening, right? So I know for me, this is like most interesting thing that you can do, like in terms of modernization, because greenfield is fun, right? It's not as challenging as modernizing something that's already there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I was going to go along something similar in terms of, the fact that there's like this maturity difference between, you're just starting out on something versus, a well-established piece of software, and it is difference in impact. And again, it's that perspective piece as well, because if you've just worked on Greenfield, or especially like the super early parts of a Greenfield project, you maybe have a certain amount of users and you might say, oh, let's just do this. On when you move to a software modernization project, and it's like, well, yeah, but when you did that, the context was a bit different. You had 100 users. We have millions of users. So it's just different in terms of the impact. And I agree, it has some different challenges because, as you said, it's going down the highway super fast. Rather than just sort of the car coming out your drive or something. It's quite a different challenge. I wanted to dig a little bit into. We kind of touched on a little bit earlier on, but in terms of the team makeup itself and maybe the different sort of skills that you would sort of look for when staffing a team approaching a software modernization project. And we can dig a little bit into as well, which is somewhat related, which is the sort of the involvement you need from the client as well, the types of people you would need to gain a good picture of a particular issue and why something's been modernized. But let's maybe start with maybe what your thoughts are, Abdul and Mac, on staffing a team and who should be in that team. I know we've sort of touched on it a little bit in terms of, we said maybe it could be even good experience for people newer to the industry, but more specifically in terms of software modernization, what do you think it should look like in terms of a team? And again, I'm saying this with the huge caveat of it depends on the exact thing to be modernized. But like in general, there's some sort of common roles and responsibilities that you've seen work well.
So from my side, I think I'm going to bring what Sandro did put in his book at some point, what he's looking for, regardless of what kind of project is. He's looking for passion, right? So that's what I also would like to see, like passionate engineers that are part of my team. And whether I'm doing something completely new from the scratch or it's software modernization work, if there are passionate engineers, they have passion for solving complex engineering problems, we're going to be good, So unless it's specifically someone that is clearly a software modernization, there's not much like platform in there, and someone really wants to be only on the platform engineering side, and probably bringing them in because not to be them too happy, right, about it. So you have to have some awareness, but yeah, if you have passionate people who are quality engineers, ingenuitive, that's what I would be looking for, right? Initially, because what more can you know, really, right, about them? Then you have to see with time, like how the team gets along and like, reacts accordingly, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. Abdul?
Yeah, I would say one of the most important things for me is a higher degree of pragmatism. I think you need very pragmatic engineers to make a modernization project work. You see a lot of projects, so we're going back to that 70% stat. I think there are two sides to that failure. One is a lack of ambition, well, we're going to sit around a whiteboard and try and figure out how to achieve, a completely safe modernization, which never gets anywhere. But then the other side of that spectrum is an excess of ambition, or well, we'll completely rewrite this component or completely rewrite the whole thing, or, a kind of overzealous approach maybe to approaching the problem. Pragmatism, I think, is extremely important, not just obviously in modernization, but in all development, but especially in modernization. You need to have a pragmatic understanding of the complexity of what you're dealing with, and a pragmatic approach to modernizing that software gradually, which we've obviously seen a number of times within our current kind of a company. So I think that, to me, that's the most qualifying aspect. And that doesn't have to necessarily be everyone in the team has to be equally pragmatic. You need a good variety in the team, I'd say. You need people that will kind of push it a little bit and say, okay, why not? Which is always great. But you also, I think, need people on the other side of it that are going to be a bit more, maybe thinking a little bit more ahead about, okay, well, where can we actually get the value in earliest? What is actually an achievable target? How can we get that feedback in earlier? I think that usually comes, in my experience, from slightly more seasoned engineers, someone that's kind of seen it a little bit. So I'd always want a kind of mix, as I say, someone maybe who's a bit younger, just come in. But I also think it's important to have people that are a bit more senior as well, have seen it, and can say, sounds like a grand idea, but 1-2 years down the line, we will not be able to release software if we go through a kind of like big bang approach of rewriting, major components, as an example. So that's my kind of preference.
It makes sense, and it's what you said. Like, maybe not everyone is going to be exactly the same place on the scale of pragmatism or etc. But for the most part, like, as a team, they're going to have a certain degree of pragmatism. As Max said, they're going to have passion, and I think making sure that you have, as a team, that perspective. And I promise this isn't my word of the day, but you have that perspective where you can recognize the impact of your decisions, because obviously we're all humans. We all have technology. We all have our own opinions, etc., and our own past experience. But you have to understand that when you're operating, especially in software modernization, that those decisions you make can have quite a large impact. So it's about understanding, well, if we decide to use technology X or Y, that can have a particular impact. Understanding the context of the organization, and sort of their preferences as well. Just understand those constraints. I think it's super important in the team, and to make sure that is understood within the team.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think there's the technology aspect of it where we need a lot of pragmatism. But I think one of the things that, and maybe we'll touch on in future discussions, a lot of legacy software exists in quote unquote legacy organizations, and that in its own right can create a lot of challenges that requires a lot of patience by a team, right? They're not necessarily working with a client that understands all of the state-of-the-art ways of working and technology adoption and what that actually implies to your ways of working, how your organization is organized. So having, again, at least individuals in the team that can deal with that, and understand the context of the client, and not necessarily create a confrontational relationship, I think is extremely important.
Interesting what you said as well around the, some people have the big ideas, but it's just putting those in sort of in the perspective of the particular situation that you find yourself in, because every single software modernization project is going to be slightly different. It's going to have different constraints. As you said, the organization is going to be different as well, that sort of project is within, and it's about just being able to balance sort of the decisions you make. You can't just come in and say, there's this, going to, it's like, you won't go to a house and say, there's this beam here, let's get rid of it, and then you take it down, and then before you know it, it's stumbled down on you. Like, you need a certain approach to modernization.
But I think in the end is any kind of extreme is bad, right? If you get only seniors in there, super pragmatic, they'll just keep on discussing things, and it will be hard for them to kick off something properly. Let's try things out, right? If you have some kind of a balance of people that want to try things, maybe they didn't do before, but they want to try them. On the other side, if you have only juniors who want to change the world, and that might also not be a good thing. But if at the beginning you're a bit smart about it and try to have a diversified team and diverse team, and then along the way, as a team lead, it's your job to kind of balance that dynamics. That's kind of the way to go, I would say.
It's a really good point, because you need that balance, as you said, because especially even with the more senior people, they maybe have seen some of these things before in a different context, but they've seen, we tried this before. So someone just come up with an idea and they're like, that won't work. And I've heard this before, that won't work. But actually, it's also about being open-minded as well, as someone more senior, where you can say, well, yeah, I did see something like this before, but maybe the context was slightly different. Maybe it's worth at least looking at and assessing it. And if you can sort of run an experiment or some sort of time-boxed activity to try and see if it has promise here, then even better. Because, well, I've never seen it work well when someone just bats down an idea and says, that didn't work before. That's not really, for me, a sign of a good team. I think what you touched on there, Mac, is just a sign of a good team and having that balance. It doesn't mean everyone's, going to be the same, because then you wouldn't have the different perspectives. You want a nice balance within a team that sort of has all of these characteristics collectively.
And so if you run the team properly, I guess with time, it evens out. I think it's these people who are more on the idealistic side, they saw this more pragmatic side that actually also makes sense, because some ideas actually don't make sense in this context. But also these more pragmatic people, they see, well, actually we have to pull the trigger on some things and see whether that works, right? That's why we are here to modernize. It's we don't know exactly what that means. We have to try some of things out, right?
So, I mean, we've covered quite a bit of ground here, and there's more we can probably go into with the teams. I wondered if maybe it would be worth looking at, maybe dig deeper into sort of legacy code or software modernization, and whether companies, what they have in terms of, does a company in general just have legacy code, or candidates to be modernized, or is there generally a mix from what you guys have found in your experience?
I'd say there's always a mix, almost always, and I think this is where, at least for me personally, the definition of legacy software is really important. You see a lot of individuals qualify everything as kind of legacy software requiring modernization, right? And I think it's really easy to do that, right? Something could be 2-3 years old, or it's not perfect, we need to modernize it. I think that's unreasonable. I think we need to be very careful about what we decide there's value in modernizing and investing that kind of effort into. Some things are perfectly good chugging along. There'll also always be usually software that's newer. Now, when it becomes legacy, it's a bit questionable. I've seen software that goes live, and within a year or two, they've got problems because it was built poorly, from the bottom line, and then requires that kind of effort to then immediately modernize it, more or less. But I've also seen new platforms built that kind of exist in isolation of the rest of the ecosystem, where they are quite innovative, fast, and then the rest of the ecosystem is a bit slower, even when they're kind of core and central to the organization. So I'd almost argue, almost without exception, you'll find a mix, depending on how you define it. And for me, again, legacy software is about software that doesn't meet the necessary kind of operational requirements of the organization for its role.
Yeah, I would kind of say the same, though. It's so in general, yes. So there's the more like legacy part of the systems and more like greenfield part of the systems. But from my experience, a lot of these greenfield projects, like Abdul mentioned, they quickly become legacy, right? So if a greenfield project starts, it's almost inevitable that it will become the parts of the legacy actually, and it will be a candidate for some kind of modernization, unless the team is they're aware of this, and as they create the software they implement, they think about this along the lines and try to apply some small improvements here and there. So maybe that process could be lengthened a bit, but still at some point it will be marked as legacy, I guess. It's like I never saw a project unless it was like a small plugin or something that did not end up as, look, there are some problems in this. We don't know exactly what, but we are slow with this. There are some bugs. And this patch is right now the patch or badge that is given to this application rather than being this greenfield perfect thing. So it's almost like a cycle, normal life cycle of an application, right? It starts with greenfield and eventually there's this legacy aspect to it, right? But I think that's fine, right? So, if that happens, the problem is the only two types of projects are, legacy maintenance and greenfield, right? And there is no the software modernization efforts like in the middle, which for sure companies of like 5-10 plus years in the back would need basically. So that's fine as long as you have this some kind of organized effort and thought efforts how to modernize the software, not just come in and say and panic that we are not able to release and there are so many bugs, which ends up in just patching more the legacy system, being it even more, less readable, less maintainable, and just going down the pit.
So you go, Abdul.
I was just going to add really quickly. I think, Maciej, that one of the main reasons we see that though is because of something you touched on earlier, which is the general expectation that software projects go into a kind of maintenance mode. So, the software is completed. Okay, now we just add a few features, and it allows through that change, that natural entropy to kind of kick in and tech debt to be accrued, especially if it's with the mentality of we're going to maintain this at the lowest possible cost, even when that software is critical to the business, because there are newer models, obviously, I say newer, like 20-year-old models, to kind of avoid that happening. So we look at like obviously extreme programming and the kind of scout rule is all there to try and stop it getting to the point where you accrue so much tech debt that eventually you end up having to take a big project to then pay that down, which will always cost more than doing it incrementally. And then if you even look beyond that to more modern thinking around things like evolutionary architecture, the idea that your system is never static and we accept that it will evolve over time. Again, it's like a kind of way of avoiding it. So I think there's something to be said about how relatively toxic the idea of moving all your software into a kind of operational state really is actually, I think, for businesses in the long term to the cost of maintaining your software.
Yeah, that's really important actually, because as you both were talking, I was thinking about examples I've seen in the past where, and this kind of got me thinking the overall question, which is like, can you really just enter like a maintenance mode for software? Because like I've seen it in the past where there's external things that affect things like one could be cost, like we're running this on this infrastructure and it's costing us like not a small amount of money to do. And we recognize that we could run it cheaper, etc. There's sort of those situations. Then there's sort of like, I don't know, AWS have said we're no longer going to run service X, and your software's running on that service. And it's like, oh, okay. And I mean, admittedly, that's sort of reasonably reactive. But I do wonder, like, when things enter like sort of this maintenance window, and sometimes you almost end up with sort of these orphaned applications that they sort of maybe then get given to like another team to look after, and they end up, with 7 different services that they didn't build, etc. To sort of in this sort of maintenance thing they never really touch. And I do wonder, like, whether you how often actually the things that are in this maintenance mode could have maybe benefited from a bit of a heavier touch, sooner.
Yeah. So again, I guess this comes the question of this, like, is it really worth it to like rewrite everything or like modernize like everything in this? And from my experience, like the best bets, I guess, for this kind of application that is legacy but is still alive, it is used in production. It's like whatever new feature you add, new piece you add to this application, it is created with the state-of-the-art technology as much as possible. Of course, there are the constraints of existing versions of the libraries, but always there is a way to decide, and it's a leadership thing. So leadership has to decide it, like, from now on, anything new feature, let's leave the legacy part, maintenance. It's like we're not going to spend our money on rewriting everything. It will be beneficial probably like for our clients and for the speed of our deliveries, but like ROI is just not enough there, right? So the best bets, what I saw, and for the most of the legacy software that I saw, that's the best bet that you can have. So decide that any new feature, you try to write it, implement it with state-of-the-art ways that you collectively decide as a team. So.
I mean, one of the techniques you can actually use to identify software is to think a little bit about that kind of Wolseley mapping. So what is commodity versus what is kind of core and differentiator within the marketplace. So one of the things you sometimes see is a lot of, if your application is some kind of old payment system that you had from ages back, and it was just a maintenance mode, and again, like AWS turns around and says, that version of SQL we're going to get rid of, then you don't modernize it, you outsource it, you get rid of it. But some software will always be a differentiator, and that software, I would always argue, should never go into an operating mode. Even if you don't see yourself making a lot of feature changes to it, it's too business critical not to be owned and cared for. And if it's truly differentiated, it will always change anyway. So I think from a leadership perspective, as you said, Maciej, you need to have your finger on the pulse about what systems are important to your organization and which ones are kind of generic and exist to support your kind of core capabilities.
I have seen it before where there's I don't know to describe this, but they almost seem quite humble that there's these applications sitting somewhere, that people don't really talk about too much, but they're actually quite critical to the business. And then you only hear about them when something goes wrong, and because they sort of entered this this operational maintenance mode, and no one really works on them. Like, you're not going to necessarily see in someone's sprint that someone's working, on this system or touching it. It is interesting what you just said, Abdul. Thanks very much, Mac and Abdul. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts on this conversation?
My only closing note is that I'm looking forward for further conversations around the topic. So that's my closing note.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess it's been really interesting. I guess talking about it briefly makes it realize actually how big a subject it is. So hopefully a lot of content to come.
Yeah, exactly. We've sort of just like peeked in, right? We've just sort of opened the door slightly. We can sort of see, things. So there's so much more to talk about, I think. Yeah, I look forward to it.